Welcome to the Little Red Podcast, which brings you China from beyond the Beijing Beltway. I'm Graham Smith from the Australian National University's Department of Pacific Affairs, and I'm joined by my co-host, Louisa Ling, former China correspondent for the BBC and NPR, now at the Centre for Advancing Journalism at Melbourne University. We're on air thanks to support from the Australian Centre on China and the World.
It's just been announced that 2025 is the year of psychiatric health in China. More funding is on its way, part of what's being called the Psy-boom. This is an explosion in the provision of psychological services that's largely happened under Xi Jinping. We'll be looking at this as part of our series on young people in China and their changing belief systems. It's much needed. China's most recent mental health survey in 2022 found that almost 7% of the population suffers from depressive disorders. This is particularly high among young people. About 50% of people with depression in China are schoolchildren. And our guests today have been researching different aspects of the Psy-boom. We're delighted to be joined from the US by Yiying Xiong, a counsellor and associate professor at John Hopkins University. We're also joined by Barclay Bram, an audio journalist at The Economist and fellow on Chinese society at the Asia Society. And finally, we're joined from Taiwan by medical anthropologist Hsuan-Ying Huang, who is at the National Ming University. Hsuan-Ying, let's start with a bit of a historical overview. I mean, I find it quite astonishing just how new psychotherapy is in China. I mean, the fact that being a psychological counsellor wasn't even recognized as a profession until 2001. I understand that in the Cultural Revolution, it was attacked as bourgeois pseudoscience. I mean, how did psychotherapy come back to China after that?
Well, I mean, it actually come back pretty early. After the beginning of the reform, Western psychotherapy came to China to bring psychological modality back. But the difference between the 80s and 90s and also the early 2000s is that in the 80s and 90s, it is the psychiatrists and also psychologists, and also I would say it's only a very small portion of psychiatry and psychologists who are learning and also practicing psychotherapy or psychological counseling. So basically, it is within the institution. So these are based in institutions, medical institutions, or academic institutions, and the number is pretty small. But in the early 2000s, the Chinese government, more specifically, the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, initiated a new certification program for a new occupation called psychological counselors. And for a variety of reasons, it became very popular. It offered a very comparatively easy way for people, just ordinary people, like without previous background in psychology or any related field, to receive training, usually very short-term training. It could range from just a few weeks or maybe a few months, and also on a part-time basis. And after this training, you could go to the exam and get people call it a license, but it's actually not a license. It's just a certification. But somehow with this certification, you could go on the market and to claim that you are a state certified counselor, and then you could begin your own private practice.
And Barclay, the sort of telling this for Xi Jinping is a bit of cognitive dissonance for me. I mean, many people see his rise in 2012 as the real beginning of this Psy-boom. I mean, do we have any evidence for that? And why is Xi Jinping interested in promoting this? It doesn't seem to sit with his rather macho orientation on other things.
Well, I think if you take like Hsuan-Ying's point, it's also that like you have an increase in the consciousness of, psychology and of mental health generally, right? So in 2001, you have this vocational qualification. And then by 2017, you had roughly 1 million people in China who had qualified. And as these people qualified, they told their friends, they started practicing in some cases. I mean, not everyone who qualified became, a full-time counselor, but you suddenly had like a pretty sizable population in China who were talking about mental health and spreading, information about psychology and mental health. You had counseling programs in schools. You had the very start of workplaces starting to have counseling programs. And then you also have online. So you have WeChat, which becomes sort of big from 2014. And on WeChat, you then have big psychological service providers. So platforms like Know Yourself and Simple Psychology, these also become really big. So Xi Jinping, these things, there's a correlation between Xi Jinping coming into power, but there's also this broad-based expansion of psychological consciousness, I think. And then, the key thing is obviously the COVID-19 pandemic. And afterwards, I think that has really, in the last 5 years, sparked a really big groundswell and interest in psychological counseling and psychotherapy.
Yiying, I think you've written, haven't you, about how COVID has broken down that stigma. Can you talk a bit about exactly how that happened?
Yeah, so I think similar to Barclay has said, I think COVID-19, and so so it has a lot of negative influence, like the economic development, all of that, and then isolation. However, I think for counseling or to improving people's awareness of mental health issues, that may be a positive thing for them, because for a lot of people, it was the first time for them to really realize there is a thing called mental health, and then during that time they really built a support system. I think there were a lot of college or universities. They initiated some a crisis line for people to call in. When you are isolated, you need that support. So there are a lot of people utilize those services and then realize that I can reach out for help. I think has been why there is a lack of development of psychology in China. I think part of the reason is because of the stigma around mental health. So I think Barclay has mentioned the reason, part of it, the increasing of the mental health counselors in China, and then also the COVID, all of that kind of make people to realize, okay, it's okay to talk about it.
And to follow on from that, Barclay, I know you've covered this. China saw some of the most extreme lockdowns in the world for COVID, in some parts of China at least. And everywhere COVID was kind of peak anxiety. Is there any way to know what kind of impact COVID had on people's mental health?
Yeah, for sure. I think I saw a statistic which was during the Shanghai lockdown, the rate of people searching on Baidu for psychological counseling was up 254%. So very significant, huge, especially in somewhere like Shanghai, which had really severe lockdowns. You had a lot of people who were very interested in trying to find, some kind of psychological support in that time. And especially in a context in which, the lockdowns are so severe, a lot of people didn't really have any room to do anything but to turn inwards.
I'm interested in this issue of the kind of language of psychology and whether that exists in Chinese, whether people have the language to talk about their mental health and their trauma. I guess maybe let's start with a historical overview. Hsuan-Ying, those people who went through the Cultural Revolution, do they even recognize what happened to them as trauma? Do they have the language to discuss that?
Well, I think language is a very interesting thing, because when I began to do research, that is back in 2007 or 2008, at that time, most of the psychological vocabulary that are very popular in China now still seems very fresh. So it's like a foreign language at that time. So people learned about these vocabularies, and they treat it as something that just imported from the West. And the translation are usually ready-made, because a lot of these terms are already translated into Chinese in Hong Kong or in Taiwan, and very often they just pick up these translations, but they feel very new to the people I know at that time. But the people who first joined the Psy-boom in the 2000s, I would call like the first decade of the Psy-boom. At that time, they are not exactly the generation who experienced Cultural Revolution. They are a bit younger. They are a bit younger. So when Cultural Revolution occurred, they were either still like small kids, or it's also quite possible that they are not born yet. So for that generation who experienced Cultural Revolution, they may have experienced a lot of trauma, but I'm not sure whether they would use that kind of language. And also trauma, I think, also occupy a very important place in the development of the Psy-boom, because every time there is a massive trauma, it would be an opportunity to develop psychological treatment. And I think the most important case would be the Wenchuan earthquake in 2008. And people would call it the first year of psychology, the 心理元年, because that is because the Chinese state, after the earthquake, began to pay attention to psychological trauma. So not just lost life and also wealth, but also invisible psychic trauma that make the idea of trauma quite popular among general population, and that trigger the very early beginning of the Psy-boom.
Does anyone want to add to that?
I think you're interested in specifically like how the Cultural Revolution was understood. The work of the medical anthropologist Arthur Kleinman is really interesting. His first book, which is called The Social Origins of Distress, he was working in a hospital in Hunan in 1986, so very soon after the end of the Cultural Revolution. And what he found was that many people were coming to the hospital and they were presenting with something that was, translated as neurasthenia, so 神经衰弱. So like the idea that their nerves were fraying and their symptoms were much more bodily, it was much more somatic. But he was able to treat them with SSRIs, selective serotonin receptor inhibitors, so antidepressants. So basically, he was treating them as if they had clinical depression. They were seeing, a marked improvement. And then, he basically wrote a number of papers at the time with some prominent Chinese psychotherapists and psychologists, psychiatrists to say, actually this condition, neurasthenia, it's actually depression. And so this was part of the transition towards a more like westernized vision of mental health care and psychiatry.
Like I feel like how Chinese describe mental health issue may be different from how westernized society describe their mental health. As Barclay has mentioned, like 神经衰弱, and which is like more like the physical symptoms of a person. And then when I reflect of like the older generation, like they usually not talk about their feelings. Instead, they talk more about like their physical symptoms. So they may feel the tense in their chest, may feel like a headache. However, they will not express their feeling like I feel sad, I feel angry. So like this part, like I feel like it seems like not a lot of people in that generation not talking about it. However, like for the younger generation, I feel more and more parents are trying to teach like social emotional learning to their children, like to allow them to have the opportunity to express their feeling and then to tell their parents like how they feel about it.
And Yiying, let's maybe talk a bit more about young people in China, because it seems that they're the ones that do have the language to talk about mental health, but they're also the group in the worst sort of mental health state, it seems. I mean, there's one CAS survey that indicates about 15% of Chinese teenagers suffer from depression. I mean, what are the factors behind this, given that Chinese society seems to be set up almost to look after children, and yet they're so miserable?
Yes, I think there could be a lot of reason, and that's not my major research interest about. However, like just from my observation, I feel like there could be like a lot of pressure from the family, like the Asian culture like emphasize a lot about academic success. So there could be a lot of emphasize from their family, from their parents, and also pressure on them. Like, so they may not have a lot of free time to play. And which is like a great need for children. So that could be one part of it. And then I feel like the sometimes like nowadays I think it's maybe a little bit better. However, I think the only child policy, so one child policy, like so there a lot of family they only have one child. So I think sometimes that may make them lack of opportunity to socialize with their peers, even though they have the opportunity to interact with their peers or their other friends. However, like it's a little bit different than having siblings. So like having sibling, like one advantage of it is like it help you to socialize and also to promote your social skills, which is very important. So one study showed that like the social connection is one of the most important factor for people's well-being. So like when you cannot like really build that relationship with people, it may be like not very helpful for their mental health. Yeah, I think there could be some other reason just based on my observation, not research based.
Well, do you want to share those? Because often anecdote, has a bit more to it.
Yeah. So one of my friends in China told me that a 6-year-old in China could write their homework until 10 p.m. So I cannot imagine, like, what will that do to a 6-year-old child? But I think that's like the atmosphere you want your children to succeed in that environment. So.
And it also seems that young people, those at university are also not doing that well. Barclay, I was going to ask you about this idea of political depression that seems to be global. Is there an aspect of it that is sort of unique or special to China?
Yeah, I mean, I would actually come off Yiying's point and say, if you have kids who are starting to study until 10 p.m., who are 6 years old, like that gives you an indication of the pressure that students are under. And, that pressure cooker environment continues through high school, then into college, and then out the other side into the job market where you have really high rates of unemployment, you have a really uncertain future. I think all of that, that social pressure is what is really contributing to this mental health crisis. It's this sense that the normative good life, the spots of success are so few in China and the competition is so severe. That's why people are fighting so tooth and nail to get government jobs, why, for the last couple of years, party membership has increased. People are trying to find stability wherever. So I think it's slightly different to political depression. I think political depression is more related to, the start of disbelief in the system, and that definitely, was ramped up during COVID-19 and really seeing the government flailing around at the end, trying to enforce lockdowns and then suddenly letting go of them. But this kind of general malaise you have in society, I think it's, this feeling of directionless that many young people have because you've invested so much in your education, you've fought so hard, and the gains of that are not actually materializing. And it doesn't seem like there are that many alternatives because, in China, you still have, it's a relatively socially conservative country. So, the options to come up with a very different kind of lifestyle or a different way of being are often curtailed for most people. So there's very limited socially recognized, forms of success. And so to achieve them, you have to really, really struggle to get there. And it's just getting harder and harder year on year.
Xuanying, it seems that almost every demographic in China is in trouble when it comes to mental health. There's astonishing horribly high rates of suicide for women, higher than men, which is quite unusual. People in rural areas have got very high rates of suicide. Is it an across-the-board problem, or are there trends over time that we can see?
So I know that rural women suicide research is very, very, very famous, but it was also quite a while ago, and I believe that the recent trend have have actually changed a lot. Even though I need to look into the latest research to give you a better picture, but I think it would be very difficult to know in an objective way about mental health status because when people know more about mental health, they also tend to use like mental health vocabulary, diagnosis, all kind of knowledge to examine themselves and also to express themselves, right? So that eventually they would become more easily identified as like having some kind of mental health issues. But after saying that, I still have to say that mental health have already loomed large as a very big issue in China, whether from the perspective of the government or among general population. And indeed, the reason like Xi Jinping administration also compared to previous Hu era, also invested a lot on like improving the infrastructure of mental health and also popularizing like mental health knowledge. And there are also some unforeseeable like events like the COVID-19 that would also serve as opportunity for the government to develop these new plans.
Could I ask, I mean, different countries seem to prefer different types of therapy. Argentina, famously the most in therapy country in the world, goes in for old school Freudian psychoanalysis. Here in Australia, cognitive behavior therapy very much dominates. We're having our own Psy-boom here. I mean, what sort of therapy is winning over the Chinese market and why?
For me, there is an obvious answer, but it's also very tricky. So when I began my research, most of the people were interested in psychoanalysis, but psychoanalysis in China cannot be understood like precisely as psychoanalysis because psychoanalysis is the most well-known school of psychotherapy in the world, right? So people would identify the birth of modern psychotherapy with the birth of Freud's invention of psychoanalysis, and Chinese people after the Cultural Revolution, the inability to develop psychology and psychotherapy during the Maoist period, they feel that they have to receive some kind of like make-up lessons, right? And they think that psychoanalysis is the very important thing that they miss. And psychoanalysis also seems very attractive because it's very deep. But psychoanalysis also needs like very rigorous long-term training that was not available in China back then. So initially, a lot of people were interested in psychoanalysis. They were interested in like a more in-depth kind of examination of their life. But it's very difficult to get proper training. But over time, it's quite tricky. Over time, people do have a bit more and more opportunity to learn psychoanalysis in a more proper way. But in general, more and more people also realize that psychoanalysis in the West have already declined for many decades, and it also require like very long-term training. So nowadays, I would say that a lot more people actually would opt for like cognitive behavior therapies, and also many newer kinds of therapy are also imported into China. So people have a lot more option to go for.
If any of you are able to talk about ways in which Chinese philosophies and ideas are being used in psychotherapy, that'd be really interesting, I think.
Yeah, I mean, so the medical anthropologist Li Jiang has a really good paper on Bentuhua and like localization techniques in the Psy-boom. And one of the things that she talks about is that actually Jungian therapy is very popular because it's kind of seen as almost like a return, because Jung looked at the I Ching and then now it's coming back. And so there are some aspects of Jung's thinking that's popular. There's one account that I followed on WeChat, which is very interested in trying to bridge like Taoism and Lacanianism. And I think, basically you have to understand that like within the Psy-boom, it's an extremely competitive marketplace. So you have these psychological counselors who are qualified. As Hsuan-Ying said, like the qualification process is pretty spotty in many cases. So then what happens is you kind of need to differentiate yourself. If you want to actually do this as a career, you have to try to find a way to like separate yourself from the crowd. And so one of the ways that you can do this is by going online and pioneering a slightly different slant on, psychological, different schools in psychological thinking. And so what you see is that, the online world of the Psy-boom is really diverse and really interesting. Also, a lot of it is really spurious, and you have a lot of translation of kind of wellness content and, kind of wacky ideas. And I think, I can't remember where I read this, but it's definitely in my PhD. But, there was one commentator who said, what the vocational qualification did is it sort of created this speedy assembly line of cowboys. And they're then, out there trying to like make money, survive in this quite brutally competitive industry. And I think one of the things that was interesting in my research was, a lot of the people that are approaching these psychological counselors are really burnt out from competing because there's no jobs. But the irony was like the psychological counselors themselves are really burnt out because they're all competing for the clients. So no one can escape this sort of involuted dynamics of the Chinese economy, not even the psychological counselors who are meant to be providing a salve.
So just trying to tie together a couple of threads. I mean, one thing you said, Barclay, is that what might have been trending, talking about how older people in China sort of took a somatic approach to describing their symptoms. And it seems that like a lot of the cutting edge, if you want to call it, psychotherapy these days is about, whether it's mindfulness, whether it's EMDR. Essentially, it's about looking at a physical way to address your mental health problems. I mean, is that getting popular in China?
I mean, one thing that I thought was interestingly somatic in my research was, family constellation therapy was really popular, which is a form of group therapy where you kind of get together and you place people in a room, and the people are meant to represent key figures in your life. And then where you place them is said to be symbolic of, where they stand in your life. And then, you have these kind of moving experiences of people putting people in the room, stepping back, and then bursting into tears because they suddenly realized that their uncle is behind their father, and what does that mean? And it's, but that is quite a somatic way to look at mental health. I mean, that's not a Chinese modality. That's, it's in a form of translation. But, I thought there are and sand play therapy is quite popular. So there are like somatic cures. But then you have this interesting trend where, in the West, we're obviously now really interested in TCM and acupuncture and yoga and Qigong. And, we talk about holistic vision of mental health and the need to heal the body as well as healing the mind. So, we're all coming around to the same ideas, I think, that you can't separate the body from the mind entirely. And I think, on both sides here, there's stuff to be learned from either culture.
And if I could just follow up on that, I mean, it seems everything that Xi Jinping promotes, he eventually ends up promoting abroad. I mean, is it possible that China could globally become a leading advocate for mental health?
Good luck. I mean, that would be a turn up. But I mean, China does have this export-led economy, so let's see if they can export that as well.
I just wanted to go back to Xi Jinping's role in all this. I mean, why do you think, and this is for anybody who feels like answering, why do you think that Xi Jinping is so keen on improving mental health?
That would be a state secret because it's impossible to know when Xi Jinping actually understand mental health. But what I could basically only observe from outside. I remember very early when I was still at CIW, China Innovation Center. At that time, like Jeremy Barman wanted us to follow Xi Jinping's footstep every day, right? So one day I saw that Xi Jinping visiting the Beijing normal university. That was probably the most important psychology department, which eventually was expanded into a psychology college in China. And Xi Jinping during the visit also showed a lot of interest on psychology research and also psychology like personnel training, like all kinds of things. So at that time, I did feel that he seemed to be very interested in psychology. So I began to follow what the national policy involved in the following years. And I saw that so Xi Jinping quite early on also pledged to double the number of psychiatrists in China. And that has been achieved several years ago. And that is actually a great achievement, like doubling the number of psychiatrists within just not so many years. And Xi Jinping also expanded the concept of mental health in China, because initially, if you look at the Hu-Wen era, mental health was actually, in the official discourse, it was envisioned in a more narrow way. It's mainly only for a more traditional kind of mental health, only for mental illness. But in the Xi Jinping era, it was expanded to the so-called more common kind of mental illnesses, and also to promote, to enhance mental well-being. So nowadays, when people in China talk about mental health, it's actually quite similar to what people in the West are approaching mental health. So it could include mental illness, like different kind of forms, like more severe form and also milder forms, and also for mental well-being, which is supposedly for people who are not, who do not have a diagnosis, who would be considered normal, even though we could also say that no one is normal. Everyone is a little bit weird, but it's also for people who are supposedly normal. So it's very expensive conception of mental health that was actually in play in China nowadays.
I mean, Barclay, a question for you. I mean, how much is this linked, do you think, to Xi Jinping's family background? I mean, his father was well known to have had mental health challenges at various points. And I believe it's rumored that his daughter studied mental health in the US. Do you think this is all related?
Yeah, I mean, so during the prints, so I basically worked on an 8-part biography of Xi Jinping that we made at The Economist a few years ago. And one of the things that, we heard was exactly that his daughter had studied psychotherapy and had actually conducted some field work at Beida amongst like elite students. And so, within his own family, I have heard credible reports that, his daughter is very interested in a westernized concept of mental health. So I'm sure he is very cognizant, at least on a family level, of these ideas. And I think, you also have to remember that, the expansion of psychological counseling throughout society has increased the demand for it. And you can see that, within party branches, like I managed in my fieldwork to attend like a party branch psychological counseling meeting in Chengdu. You can see in like the police departments, the fire departments, within the army, counseling has been expanded throughout as a tool, both to promote mental well-being, but also as a way to manage people's, affective needs.
So you were present at the meeting in the party branch?
Well, yes, I was doing fieldwork with a private psychological counseling company. And one day, one of the counselors was like, oh, yeah, you should just follow me, for a couple of days. I'm doing, I'm going to this workplace. Oh, I'm going to this party branch. And I was like, am I allowed to come to that? And they were like, yeah, it's fine. You're with me. And then I sort of came and I was able to sit in this meeting. And then at the end, they sort of took the counselor aside and were like, never bring that guy again. But it was also really funny because like in the meeting, they did do a bunch of like, mindfulness drills at the beginning. So everyone like closed their eyes and were told to like tap into their body, and they were told to, think about a time they'd been really happy, think about a time they'd been really sad. And then they flashed up a bunch of, what are things that make me anxious? And, how do I describe anxiety? And what is burnout? And what does it mean to overwork? Which got, a lot of big laughs in the room because obviously everyone was burnt out and overworked. But yeah, it was very funny to be able to go to that.
So, I mean, do you think that this boom is actually useful for the party in that it also allows a kind of escape valve to let off steam for people and perhaps to show that the party cares by allowing, by bringing mental health into sort of public discussion and providing those services?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so the medical anthropologist Ma Yiying, she has a really good paper on guan, like, and the dual meanings of guan, like to both care and to control, which I think is really good. And in this context, I think it's very relevant. But, let's be honest, it's not just the Communist Party of China, right? Like Google also has mindfulness programs, and every major tech company has a wellness officer, and all of the these same techniques of governance. Like this is also just a neoliberal trend globally, right? And there's no reason to think that China wouldn't study global trends and also apply them. I mean, they're very effective, right? It's much, it is much cheaper to give someone a mindfulness app where you can sit in silence for 10 minutes rather than paying them overtime. and that is true in China and the West.
Could I maybe get to the other side of that, the side of it that's a bit harder for the party to regulate, particularly in the online space? I mean, even here in Australia, young people kind of self-diagnose by going onto TikTok. Is there sort of a Chinese equivalent of that where people are, looking for information and are possibly not getting what the party branch meeting would be giving them?
I definitely think so. I think like that's the curiosity of young people, like the when you learn a new term, like you always want to know whether you are like which part, which tab, whether you have that diagnosis. I remember when I first learned those diagnosis terms, I did that to myself as well. So I think like for young people, like that's like their curiosity trying to find information. And recently I noticed like there has been very popular, the MBTI test has been very popular in the social media, like the red note, little red notes, like talking about what type you are. So it seems people like trying to use like all those resources to find out something related to their mental health, or personality is also part of their mental health related. So, but I don't know whether it is reliable, and then whether you want to like really put that kind of label to yourself, like I'm depressed, I am like whatever type I am regarding like MBTI. So whether that's helpful. However, I think by learning those terms, that help people to know more knowledge or be more aware of mental health issues. I think that's maybe a good thing for them, like to raise their awareness of how to talk about their mental health issues, or have more terms to describe it.
A lot of this actually serves party priorities, because if you allow people to turn inwards, then what they're not doing is looking outwards at, some of the bigger issues that are impacting their lives. And I think that was very much the terrain of my PhD, which is looking at, in a situation of foreclosed autonomy, in the sense of, everyone in my PhD, the oldest person that I interviewed was born in 1949. So everyone had only lived under the Communist Party of China. And even though in that time, they had experienced huge changes, and, what it meant to live under Communist Party rule in the 1950s, not what it means to live under Communist Party rule in the 2000s, and not what it means in 2025 either. But, the one continuity there is the Communist Party of China. And so many people, therefore, don't necessarily think that the political system is going to change massively in the next, decade or 2 decades. But what they can change is themselves. And so psychotherapy is a really good tool in this situation to feel a greater sense of personal agency and autonomy, because at least if you can't change what's happening to you, you can change your response to it. And so in many ways, it does help people. Like people do tend to feel better when they engage with these tools and these, in a Foucauldian sense, these like technologies of the self. It does help, but it also can, if you're being critical about it, it does, serve the interests of power in that maybe it means that they don't actually end up in the street. They don't end up trying to tear the system down because they're trying to fix themselves rather than fix the wider social problems.
I mean, finally, I'm really struck by Barclay's description of this assembly line of cowboys and this idea of the Psy-boom enabling sort of wild explosion of sort of barely licensed people. Starting with you, Hsuan-Ying, I mean, what is the future? Do you think the Psy-boom is going to be followed by a Psy-bust or a kind of crackdown where they're going to have to come in and regulate more because there's so many people out there offering sort of quite questionable services, or is it the case that no matter what, these are still serving the interests of power, as Barclay has just described?
It's actually quite difficult to predict the future, but I think there has been talks about some kind of regulation for quite a while, from the mental health legislation that was so the first mental health law that was enacted in 2013, that was already 12 years ago. So from that time, there has been constant talks between the state and also professions about how to regulate this like very, very vibrant and also quite chaotic market. But I think it's quite difficult to achieve a consensus in the near future because China is actually quite have very uneven development. So it would be very difficult to have a national standard. And so you could see that at least the state make a very decisive move in 2017. The certification for psychological counselors, which have long been, I would say, the driving force, one of the major driving force for the Psy-boom, was discontinued in 2017 after producing roughly like 1.5 million certified counselors. So that at least stop a major source of like further chaos, I would say. And also, I think there has been a lot of investment on formal education. So training people within the higher education or medical framework. So this kind of more formal kind of programs have increased quite a lot in the recent decade. So more people will go into like more formal kind of training, and also fewer and fewer people will come from that kind of more dubious kind of training. So I would say that there was still like a gradual trend for improvement.
Yiying, can you add anything from the experiences of, I believe you've been working with Chinese counselors who train in the US and then go back to China to work. From their experiences, what are they seeing?
Yeah, for sure. The Chinese Psychological Society, they started to have some regulation of their criteria. Is quite similar to the U.S. They notice those positive things. However, they also notice some challenges when they're going back to China for practice. So because they have already experienced the mental health system in the U.S., so they feel there is sometimes lack of support or lack of regulation regarding like the mental health profession. For example, like in the US, we have case manager. We have like easy to collaborate with other disciplines. For example, if you need to refer your clients to a psychiatrist, it's pretty easy for you to do that. However, like when like this students that we interviewed noticed that it's a little bit hard for them to refer to a psychiatrist or to build that collaboration relationship with them. And also part of the challenge is like the culture difference. So they have been trained in the US or the westernized system. And then a lot of the terms used in the US is not similar to what they will use in Chinese. So I think one of the simple example they gave to us. So in the US, how you're greeting people is usually how are you? However, in China, it's like 你吃了吗? Whether you have eaten. So like such slightly, like a very slightly differences, like you need to adjust it. And then a lot of the terms they learned in the US, like it cannot directly transfer back to Chinese. It will be very weird. So they kind of trying to adjust it by themselves because there is not a lot of research or like training to talk to help them with that adjustment. So that has been like a lot of challenge, and also still dealing with like people's lack of awareness. For example, like they mentioned like some of the parents, they like lack of awareness of when to help their children, when to help their children to seek out for help, those issues. So like I think they notice positive things. However, like they also realize there are a lot of things need to be done, and especially for the systematic level, there is a lot of things need to be done.
And finally, Barclay, I mean, where do you see China's mental health industry going? I mean, are the cowboys going to win out? Are they going to become a mental health superpower? What do you see in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think actually, as psychological consciousness increases in the society, that people become, if you believe in the presence of a free market, then people can become more sophisticated consumers of psychological stuff. So the more that they understand what psychology is, what mental health is, the more you hope that they would be able to sniff out the real rogue cowboys. But, psychological counseling is having to compete with also like, a massive increase in the wellness industry in China, a huge resurgence of various forms of spirituality. So it's a very diverse and rich, psychic landscape in China at the moment. And I think psychotherapy for most people forms one part of this exploration of the self in this context of a lot of flux and change. So, I think there's definitely room for the cowboys, but hopefully there's also room for, much else and more improvement for people.
That's a pretty good place to end. Everyone, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Little Red Podcast, bringing you China from beyond the Beijing Beltway. Many thanks to our guests and to my co-host, Louisa Lim. We're on air thanks to support from the Australian Centre on China and the World. Our editing is by Andy Hazel, background research by Wing Kwong, our music is by Susie Wilkins, and our cartoons and GIFs are courtesy of Seb Danta. Bye for now.